In the early hours of March 17, 2006, the parking lot behind Murphy's Tavern in Lockhart, Texas sat empty under a sky that hadn't yet begun to lighten. The air was cool, carrying the scent of mesquite smoke from someone's late-night barbecue and the faint smell of beer-soaked wood from the bar's back door. Lockhart was quiet at this hour, the kind of quiet that settles over small Texas towns when the last patrons have stumbled home and even the night shift workers have clocked out. The tavern sat on the southern edge of downtown, where the historic brick storefronts gave way to warehouses and auto repair shops. During the day, tourists came through on their way to the famous barbecue joints that put Lockhart on the map. But at 3 in the morning, there was no one to see the dark sedan parked at an odd angle near the dumpster, no one to notice that its driver's side door stood open, interior light long since faded to black. It would be another 4 hours before anyone found them. When the sun finally rose over Caldwell County that Friday morning, painting the limestone courthouse downtown in shades of pink and gold, a delivery driver pulling into the lot to drop off kegs saw what at first looked like someone sleeping it off in their car. He walked closer. Then he stopped. Then he ran back to his truck and called 911 with hands that wouldn't stay steady. Inside the sedan were 3 young people. 2 men and 1 woman, all in their early 20s. They weren't sleeping. They would never wake up again. Before we go any further into this story, take a moment to hit subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to know how far these stories reach. This channel brings you true crime stories from small communities across America, cases that remind us that silence has a cost, and that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of surfacing when the pressure finally becomes too much to bear. The victims were identified quickly. In a town the size of Lockhart, population barely pushing 13,000, most faces were familiar. The 2 men were Marcus Chen, 23, who'd grown up in Austin but moved to Lockhart 2 years earlier to work at his uncle's machine shop, and Tyler Benson, 22, a local boy who'd graduated from Lockhart High and never left, working construction and living in the same house where he'd grown up. The woman was Jennifer Hayes, 21, who worked the morning shift at the H-E-B grocery store and spent her evenings taking classes at Austin Community College, driving the 30 miles each way because she had plans that extended beyond Caldwell County. They'd been shot multiple times. The medical examiner would later determine that all 3 died sometime between 2 and 4 in the morning, though pinpointing the exact time proved difficult. There were no witnesses who'd come forward. No one had heard gunshots, or if they had, they'd dismissed them as fireworks or a truck backfiring, sounds that don't register as urgent in the moment but echo differently in memory once you know what they meant. The Lockhart Police Department, a force of fewer than 30 officers, had never handled anything like this. Chief Raymond Torres, 56 years old and a fixture in town for 3 decades, stood in that parking lot as the sun climbed higher and the Texas heat began to build, looking at 3 body bags being loaded into the medical examiner's van, and felt the weight of something he couldn't yet name. This wasn't a bar fight gone wrong. This wasn't a robbery. This was execution. The investigation began the way all investigations begin, with questions that seem simple but rarely yield simple answers. Who were these 3 people? What connected them? Why were they together in a parking lot at 3 in the morning? And who wanted them dead? Marcus Chen's uncle, David Chen, sat across from detectives in an interview room that smelled of burnt coffee and described his nephew as quiet, reliable, someone who showed up on time and did his work without complaint. Marcus had come to Lockhart after dropping out of the University of Texas, not because he'd failed but because he'd grown tired of sitting in lecture halls talking about life instead of living it. He'd wanted to work with his hands, wanted to save money, wanted to figure out what came next. He'd rented a small apartment above a dry cleaner on San Jacinto Street and spent his weekends fixing up an old motorcycle he'd bought for $500 from a guy in Luling. Tyler Benson's mother, Carol, could barely speak through her tears. Her son had been a good kid, she kept saying, as if repetition could make it more true, as if it could bring him back. Tyler had played football in high school, offensive line, not talented enough for college ball but strong and dependable, the kind of player coaches loved because he showed up to every practice and never complained about the hits. After graduation, he'd done what a lot of young men in Lockhart did. He'd gone to work. Construction, mostly, whatever jobs his father could help him find. He'd been saving for a truck, something newer than the beat-up Ford he drove, something he could be proud of. Jennifer Hayes's parents, Robert and Sandra Hayes, sat in their living room with the curtains drawn and spoke about their daughter in voices that sounded hollow, scraped clean of everything but grief. Jennifer had been the first person in their family to go to college. She was studying business administration, had dreams of opening her own shop one day, something with flowers or antiques, she hadn't decided yet. She'd worked full-time and gone to school part-time and never complained about being tired. She'd been dating someone, they said, but it had ended a few months back. She'd been spending more time with friends lately. She'd seemed happy. What the families couldn't answer, what none of them seemed to know, was why these three particular people had been together that night. Marcus and Tyler had been acquaintances, maybe friends, it was hard to say. They'd hung out at Murphy's occasionally, played pool, had a few beers. But Jennifer? She didn't drink much. She didn't go to Murphy's. She had class the next morning. The detectives working the case, Torres and a younger officer named Michael Reyes, began piecing together the victim's final hours. Marcus had left work at the machine shop around 5:30 that Thursday evening. He'd gone home, changed clothes, grabbed something to eat. Tyler had finished a construction job in South Lockhart around the same time, stopped at a gas station for a six-pack, and headed home to shower. Jennifer had gotten off work at HEB at 4, driven home, and according to her roommate, left again around 8:30, saying she was meeting a friend. Around 9 that night, Marcus's truck had been spotted in the parking lot of a Dairy Queen on the highway. Tyler's Ford was seen outside a convenience store around 10. And Jennifer's small Honda had been caught on a traffic camera heading south on Highway 183 at 10:15. After that, the trail went cold until their bodies were found in that parking lot. Murphy's Tavern became the focal point. The owner, Jack Murphy, a man in his 60s who'd run the place for 20 years, said he didn't remember seeing any of them that night. It had been a slow Thursday, maybe 20 people in and out all evening, mostly regulars. He closed up around midnight, locked the doors, and went home. He didn't check the back parking lot. He never did. Had someone lured them there? Had they planned to meet? The positioning of the car, the fact that all three were inside it, suggested they hadn't been trying to escape. They'd been sitting there, perhaps talking, perhaps waiting for someone. Then that someone had approached the vehicle and opened fire. The ballistics report came back. 9mm handgun. 12 shots fired. Every bullet had been accounted for, either in the victims or embedded in the car's interior. Whoever did this had stood close, had aimed deliberately, had made sure the job was finished. In those first weeks, Lockhart became a town folded in on itself. People who'd once left their doors unlocked at night now checked them twice. Parents who'd let their teenagers roam freely now insisted on curfews and constant check-ins. The barbecue joints still drew their crowds, but conversations were quieter, eyes more watchful. Everyone had theories. Everyone had suspicions. But theories and suspicions aren't evidence. The investigation sprawled in multiple directions. Detectives looked at Marcus's past in Austin, whether he'd left behind debts or enemies. They examined Tyler's construction work, whether he'd angered someone, crossed the wrong person. They dug into Jennifer's life, her ex-boyfriend, her classmates, anyone who might have harbored resentment. They found nothing that pointed toward murder. These were ordinary young people living ordinary lives, and that ordinariness made their deaths even more incomprehensible. Tips poured in. Anonymous calls to the police department, whispered conversations overheard and reported, rumors that spread like wildfire through a town hungry for answers. Someone claimed they'd seen a suspicious vehicle near Murphy's that night, couldn't describe it beyond dark and maybe a truck. Someone else said they'd heard Marcus talking about owing money, but couldn't remember to whom or for what. A woman called to say Jennifer had seemed nervous lately, but when pressed, couldn't articulate why. Every lead was followed. Every lead dissolved into nothing. Months passed. The media coverage that had initially flooded Lockhart, reporters from Austin and San Antonio setting up outside the police station, slowly ebbed away. The story slipped from the front page to the inside sections, then disappeared altogether. For the families, though, time didn't move forward. It circled, endlessly returning to that March morning when everything stopped. Robert Hayes stopped going to work. He'd sit in Jennifer's old bedroom, surrounded by her things, her textbooks and her jewelry box and the posters still on the walls from her high school years, and he'd wonder what she'd been thinking in those final moments. Carol Benson started driving by Murphy's Tavern several times a week, parking across the street and just staring at the building, as if proximity to the place where her son died might offer some kind of understanding. David Chen closed the machine shop for 2 weeks, unable to concentrate, unable to look at the workbench where Marcus used to stand. Chief Torres felt the case weighing on him like a physical thing. He'd wake at 3 in the morning and go over the files again, searching for what they'd missed, what thread they hadn't pulled. He'd been in law enforcement long enough to know that some cases go unsolved. But knowing it and accepting it were different things entirely. By the time 2007 arrived, the investigation had effectively stalled. Not officially closed, but no longer active. The file sat on Torres's desk, a constant reminder, but there were other crimes, other emergencies, the daily machinery of police work that couldn't stop just because one case refused to yield answers. The families tried to find ways to live with the absence. Jennifer's parents started a small scholarship fund in her name for Lockhart High students pursuing business degrees. Carol Benson volunteered at the church, keeping herself busy, keeping herself moving because stopping meant drowning. David Chen eventually reopened the machine shop, though Marcus's old workbench remained exactly as he'd left it, tools hung on the pegboard in the same positions, a coffee mug sitting on the shelf with his name written on it in fading marker. Years accumulated. 2008, 2009. 2010, the triple homicide became part of Lockhart's history, a dark chapter that people mentioned when discussing the town's rare violent crimes but no longer actively discussed over morning coffee or evening beers. New officers joined the police department who hadn't worked the case, who only knew it as that unsolved murder from years back. Chief Torres retired in 2011, and Michael Reyes, now a detective himself, took on more responsibilities. The file was passed to him, one more cold case in a drawer full of them. But cold cases aren't truly cold. They're dormant. And sometimes, all it takes is one person who can't let go. In Jennifer's case, that person was her younger sister, Amanda Hayes. She'd been 17 when Jennifer died, a junior in high school, and in the 13 years that followed, she'd never stopped thinking about that night. Never stopped asking questions. Never stopped pushing for answers. Amanda became a paralegal, working for a law firm in San Marcos, and she spent her free time doing what the police no longer had the resources to do. She kept investigating. Amanda filed open records requests. She obtained copies of the case file, hundreds of pages of reports and witness statements and forensic analyses. She created spreadsheets, timelines, maps. She tracked down people who'd been interviewed in 2006 and interviewed them again, recording conversations, taking notes, looking for inconsistencies or details that might have been overlooked. She posted about the case on social media, creating a page dedicated to finding justice for Marcus, Tyler, and Jennifer, sharing photos and information, keeping their names alive in a world that had moved on. Her parents worried. They loved her determination but feared it was consuming her, that she was anchoring herself to a tragedy that wouldn't let her build a future. But Amanda couldn't stop. Every time she thought about walking away, she'd remember Jennifer driving her to school, Jennifer helping her with homework, Jennifer telling her that she was smart and capable and could do anything she set her mind to. How could she honor that memory by giving up? In 2015, Amanda's persistence led her to someone the police had interviewed briefly in 2006 but never followed up with extensively. His name was Craig Holland, 41 years old, and in 2006 he'd been a regular at Murphy's Tavern, someone who'd been there the night of the murders, though he'd left before closing time. He'd told police he didn't see anything unusual, didn't know the victims, and that had been the end of it. But Amanda noticed something in the old reports. Craig's statement had been unusually brief. Not because he hadn't been willing to talk, but because the detective interviewing him had been called away to another scene and never came back to finish. It was a small oversight, the kind of thing that happens during chaotic investigations when leads are pouring in faster than they can be processed. But it meant Craig had never been pressed for details. Amanda found him living in a trailer park on the outskirts of Lockhart. He was older now, grayer, worn down by years of hard drinking and harder living. She knocked on his door on a Saturday afternoon in September, introduced herself, and asked if he remembered the night Jennifer Hayes, Marcus Chen, and Tyler Benson died. Craig's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Surprise. Discomfort. Something that looked like guilt. He invited her in. The trailer was small and cluttered, dishes in the sink, laundry piled on a chair. Craig offered her a beer and she declined. They sat across from each other at a wobbly table, and Craig lit a cigarette with shaking hands. What Craig told Amanda that afternoon was this: he'd been at Murphy's that Thursday night in March 2006. He'd seen Marcus and Tyler come in around 10:30, which matched the timeline. They'd ordered beers, played a game of pool. They'd seemed relaxed. Normal. Then, around 11:15, they'd gotten a phone call. Craig couldn't hear what was said, but he saw Tyler answer, listen for a moment, then nod and say something to Marcus. They'd finished their beers quickly after that and left. But here was the detail Craig hadn't mentioned to police in 2006, the detail that had been eating at him for 9 years: he'd followed them outside. Not because he was suspicious, but because he'd been ready to leave too, and the parking lot was dark, and he'd wanted to make sure his truck was still there. Theft wasn't common in Lockhart, but it happened. He'd seen Marcus and Tyler get into Marcus's sedan. And he'd seen someone else approach the car. A figure walking across the lot from the direction of the street, moving with purpose. Craig had been drunk, he admitted, his memory fuzzy around the edges. But he remembered thinking the person looked familiar, though he couldn't place from where. The figure had gone to the driver's side window, leaned down, appeared to be talking. Then Craig had gotten into his own truck and driven away. He'd told himself at the time that it was nothing. Friends meeting up. A conversation. None of his business. Later, when he'd heard about the murders, he'd felt sick. But by then, days had passed. And he'd convinced himself that what he'd seen couldn't have been important, that if it was, surely someone else would have seen it too, reported it. He'd told himself he hadn't really seen anything useful anyway, just a figure in the dark, too far away and too drunk to describe. But the guilt had followed him. Every year on the anniversary, it got worse. He'd drive by the memorial that Jennifer's parents maintained at the courthouse, 3 small plaques with the victims' names, and he'd wonder if what he'd seen that night might have mattered. He'd wonder if staying silent made him complicit. Amanda listened to all of this without interrupting. Then she asked the question that had brought her there: could he describe the person he'd seen? Craig closed his eyes, reaching back through years of trying to forget. Medium height. That much he remembered. Not particularly large or small. Wearing dark clothes, maybe jeans and a jacket. The walk had been distinctive, though he struggled to articulate how. Purposeful. Direct. Like someone who knew exactly where they were going and why. And then Craig said something that changed everything: the person had walked with a slight limp. Not dramatic, just a little hitch in their step, favoring the left leg. Amanda felt something click into place. She'd read every interview in the case file, and she remembered a name that had come up peripherally: someone who'd known Tyler from high school, someone who'd been questioned and cleared. Someone who'd injured his left knee playing football and walked with a permanent limp. His name was Derek Vaughn. Derek Vaughn had been 24 in 2006, 2 years older than Tyler. They'd played football together at Lockhart High, Derek a running back with real talent, Tyler an offensive lineman who'd protected him. They'd been friends, or at least friendly, the kind of connection that exists in small towns where everyone knows everyone through overlapping circles of work and family and shared history. Derek had gone to college on a football scholarship, Texas State University in San Marcos, but a knee injury his sophomore year had ended his athletic career. He'd dropped out, moved back to Lockhart, and struggled to find his footing. He'd worked various jobs, never staying long, always seeming restless, always carrying the weight of a future that had been taken away. He'd been interviewed by police in 2006 because his name appeared in Tyler's phone records. They'd spoken several times in the week before the murders. But Derek's alibi for the night of March 17 had been solid. He'd been home with his girlfriend. She'd confirmed it. The police had moved on. Amanda brought what Craig had told her to Detective Reyes, the only member of the original investigation still with the department. Reyes was skeptical at first. Craig was a known alcoholic with a history of unreliable statements. The limp could describe multiple people. And Derek Vaughn had been cleared years ago. But Amanda pressed. She'd done her homework. She pointed out that Derek's girlfriend at the time, the one who'd provided his alibi, had broken up with him 6 months after the murders and moved to Dallas. No one had ever followed up with her. She pointed out that Derek's phone records from 2006 showed more contact with Tyler than the initial investigation had revealed. She pointed out that in the years since the murders, Derek had been arrested twice for assault, both cases involving bar fights, both times displaying what the reports described as explosive rage. Reyes agreed to take another look. In November 2015, Detective Reyes drove to Dallas to interview Derek's ex-girlfriend, a woman named Michelle Torres. She was 32 now, married, working as a nurse. She invited him into her home and offered coffee, and when he explained why he was there, her expression shifted from polite confusion to something darker. She'd lied in 2006. Derek hadn't been home with her the night of the murders. He'd left their apartment around 10:30, saying he needed to take care of something. She'd asked what, and he'd told her not to worry about it. He'd come back around 3 in the morning, agitated, pacing their small living room, refusing to talk. When the news broke about the murders the next day, Michelle had felt a cold certainty settle in her stomach. But Derek had been insistent when police came asking questions. He'd told her exactly what to say, and he'd made it clear what would happen if she didn't. He'd never explicitly threatened her, but the implication was there, in his voice, in the way he looked at her. So she'd lied. And then she'd spent 6 months terrified, unable to sleep, unable to meet his eyes, until finally she'd broken up with him and moved away, trying to put as much distance as possible between herself and whatever he'd done that night. Why hadn't she come forward later? Reyes asked. Michelle's answer was simple and devastating: because she was afraid. Because she'd already lied to police. Because she didn't know if they'd believe her. Because Derek had always found a way to make people afraid, even when he smiled, even when he acted friendly. There was something in him that recognized no boundaries. Reyes returned to Lockhart with a case that was no longer cold. He obtained a warrant to re-examine phone records from March 2006, this time focusing specifically on Derek Vaughn's cell activity. The technology had been more limited back then, but there was enough data to place Derek's phone in the vicinity of Murphy's Tavern between 11 p.m. and midnight on the night of the murders. The pieces were assembling. Craig Holland's testimony about the figure with a limp. Michelle Torres's confession that she'd lied about Derek's alibi. The phone records placing him at the scene. But Reyes needed more. He needed motive. He needed to understand why Derek Vaughn would murder 3 people, 2 of whom he barely knew. The answer came from an unexpected source: financial records. In digging through Derek's background, investigators discovered that in early 2006, he'd been in significant debt. Gambling debts, mostly, accumulated through online poker and sports betting. He'd borrowed money from several people, including Tyler Benson. Tyler had loaned him $3,000 in January 2006, with the understanding it would be repaid by March. But March had come and gone, and Derek hadn't paid. Tyler had been pressuring him. Text messages recovered from archived phone company data showed Derek promising to pay, Tyler growing increasingly. Jennifer Hayes and Marcus Chen had been collateral damage. They'd been with Tyler that night because Tyler had called them, asked them to meet him at Murphy's. He'd wanted backup, wanted witnesses, wanted Derek to understand he was serious. The meeting in the parking lot was supposed to be a confrontation, an attempt to get Derek to honor his obligation. Instead, Derek had brought a gun. The investigation moved quickly once the pieces aligned. In January 2016, Detective Reyes and a team of officers drove to Austin, where Derek Vaughn had been living in a duplex near the university, working as a bartender. They arrested him without incident. He didn't resist. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He simply stood there in his kitchen, hands behind his back, and let them put the cuffs on. During the interrogation, Derek said nothing for the first hour. He sat across from Reyes in a room that smelled of stale air and old coffee, arms folded, eyes on the table. Reyes laid out the evidence methodically. Craig Holland's testimony. Michelle Torres's revised statement. The phone records. The financial motive. Derek listened to all of it. Then, finally, he looked up. What he said was this: Tyler wouldn't let it go. Derek had been trying to scrape together the money, but Tyler kept calling, kept texting, kept pushing. That night, Tyler had demanded a meeting, said he was bringing people with him, said Derek needed to understand this was serious. Derek had felt cornered, humiliated, angry at Tyler for loaning him money in the first place and then acting like Derek was some kind of criminal for being late paying it back. He'd gone to Murphy's with the gun because he wanted Tyler to see it, wanted him to understand that Derek wasn't someone to be pushed around. It was supposed to be intimidation. But when Tyler saw the gun, instead of backing down, he'd gotten angry. Started yelling. The girl, Jennifer, she tried to calm things down, but Marcus had reached for something, maybe his phone, maybe nothing, Derek couldn't remember. And Derek had panicked. He'd fired. Once, then again, then he couldn't stop. The sound had been enormous in the confined space of the car, and afterward there'd been silence so complete it felt like the world had ended. He'd driven home. Changed clothes. Burned them in a barrel behind his apartment complex. Told Michelle to lie. Spent 10 years pretending he hadn't done it, pretending he could live with it. But he couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw them. Every time someone mentioned Lockhart, his stomach twisted. He'd known eventually it would catch up to him. Part of him was relieved it finally had. If you believe Jennifer, Marcus, and Tyler deserved someone to keep pushing until the truth came out, hit subscribe. Because that's exactly what Amanda Hayes did for almost a decade, and this is how stories like theirs stay alive. Derek Vaughn was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. The trial took place in the summer of 2017 in Caldwell County, the courthouse packed with people who'd waited 11 years for this moment. The prosecution presented the timeline, the evidence, the testimony from Craig Holland and Michelle Torres. Derek's own confession was played for the jury, his voice flat and emotionless as he described pulling the trigger. The defense argued that Derek had acted in panic, that he'd felt threatened, that this was manslaughter at worst. But the jury didn't buy it. The deliberations lasted 4 hours. They returned with guilty verdicts on all 3 counts. In September 2017, Derek Vaughn was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He showed no emotion when the sentence was read. He was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, and he didn't look back. For the families, the verdict brought something that wasn't quite closure but felt close enough. Robert and Sandra Hayes stood on the courthouse steps afterward, holding each other, and told reporters that their daughter could finally rest. They thanked Amanda for never giving up, for loving Jennifer enough to spend years of her own life seeking justice. Tyler Benson wept openly, not from sadness but from relief so profound it felt like drowning. Chen said nothing to the press, but he went back to the machine shop and finally, after 11 years, cleared Marcus's workbench. Amanda Hayes, now 31, sat alone in her car in the courthouse parking lot after everyone else had left and allowed herself to cry. She'd done what she'd set out to do. She'd made sure the truth came out. She'd made sure Jennifer's death meant something. But the cost had been high. 11 years of her life focused on this one thing. Relationships that had suffered or ended because she couldn't let go. Nights spent poring over files instead of building a future. She'd do it again, she knew that. But it had taken something from her that she couldn't name. Lockhart, Texas, tried to move forward. The memorial at the courthouse remained, but now it included a plaque noting that justice had been served. Murphy's Tavern closed in 2018, not because of the murders but because Jack Murphy retired and couldn't find a buyer. The building sat empty for a while, then was eventually torn down to make room for a medical clinic. The parking lot where 3 young people died became a place where sick children came to get well. Some people found poetry in that. Others just found it sad. This case mattered not because of its brutality but because of its ordinariness. Derek Vaughn wasn't a monster. He was a man who felt cornered and made a choice that destroyed 4 lives, the 3 he took and his own. Tyler Benson had simply wanted to be paid back. Jennifer Hayes and Marcus Chen had simply wanted to help a friend. None of them had deserved what happened in that parking lot. And the resolution came not from advanced technology or forensic breakthroughs, but from persistence. From one woman who refused to accept that silence was the final answer. From a witness who carried guilt for 9 years before finally speaking up. From a detective who took a cold case seriously enough to drive to Dallas and ask questions that should have been asked a decade earlier. Justice arrived 13 years late. But it arrived. And in those 13 years, the families learned something about endurance that no one should have to learn. They learned that you can survive the unsurvivable. That you can wake up every morning even when waking up feels impossible. That love doesn't end when life does, it just changes shape, becomes something you carry instead of something you share. Rest in peace, Jennifer Hayes. Rest in peace, Marcus Chen. Rest in peace, Tyler Benson. Your lives mattered. Your deaths were not forgotten. And the woman who loved you enough to spend years fighting for you made sure the world would remember your names. These stories are for people who believe the human spirit doesn't break, even after decades of silence. People like that don't look away. They stay. They push. They refuse to accept that some questions will never be answered. If you're one of those people, you already understand why this work matters. You already understand why channels like this exist. Not to sensationalize tragedy, but to honor it. To bear witness. To remind us all that truth, no matter how long it hides, will eventually find the light. I'll see you in the next one.